Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. I'm here with Barry Eichengreen, who is a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and also the author of many books. Most recently, this one, In Defense of Public Debt, co-authored with some other folks. And then also, not too long ago, this book, The Populist Temptation. This one, I think, is in the third edition, which is Globalizing Capital. This one, I think it was about 5 years ago that this one came out. It's Hall of Mirrors, which is kind of a review of the history of the Great Depression and Bretton Woods, but also books Exorbitant Privilege, how global currencies work, gold standard, and of course, one that I used as my textbook for a class in financial history, gosh, it must have been 25 years ago, Golden Fetters, which was really all about the gold standard. I think it's safe to say, Barry, that you're one of the leading, if not the leading, kind of authorities on international currency markets and their history. And so welcome. Glad to speak with you today, Barry.
Good to be here, Greg. Thank you for the free advertising.
Well, this latest book, it's called In Defense of Public Debt. And, it's kind of odd that there needs to be such a defense, and any more so than there is like a defense of corporate debt or a defense of, personal debt. But I guess there are some folks out there that have been beating the drum for, balanced budgets and eliminating, public debt. And even though maybe some of them seem a little strange or fail to understand how debt can create value, there is sort of a point, right? And the point is that debt can be put to good uses or bad uses, and we can have too much debt or too little debt. And so even though eliminating debt might be a rather crude remedy, there might be some logic to this. So maybe you're going to tackle head on, right? Why public debt exists in the first place and why it continues to serve an important role in policy. Most particularly, we've just experienced, I think, probably the largest peacetime run-up of debt in human history. I mean, I can't think of, even when the French Revolution happened in 1789, the amount of debt that the French crown had was really, as a percentage of GNP, only a tiny fraction of what we're facing right now, kind of worldwide. So first of all, before we defend it, like why does there need to be a defense of public debt?
Well, if you read the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, for example, you'll find a very one-sided discussion of public debt that focuses on the risks and the costs without also talking about the productive or necessary uses. So we thought it was important even before COVID-19 to point out that public debt has been critically important in history to enable states to meet emergencies. So it is historically, if you look at the history, it has been issued typically in wartime to defend the realm. Admittedly, states and rulers have issued it to fight offensive as well as defensive wars, but to meet foreign threats, pandemics, natural disasters, other national emergencies. Actually, this goes way back in history, and to amend your discussion of the French and Napoleonic Wars a little bit, Britain came out of that episode in circa 1821 with a debt to GDP ratio of 200%. In other words, twice the burden that we in the United States
kind of close to Japan right now, right?
The Japanese case is difficult because the Japanese government also has a lot of assets as well as a lot of debt. So their public debt is about 250% of GDP in gross terms. But if you subtract off the assets and look at net debt, it's about 150% of GDP. So even relative to Japan today, post-Napoleonic War, Britain stands out. And that's a really interesting case because they paid down that debt. They basically extinguished it over the course of the subsequent century. So understanding that experience can potentially speak to what is possible and what is not possible in terms of managing our debt going forward.
Right. So I think public debt is different. However, I mean, I made that comparison to, private debt for individuals and corporations. And I think some of the reasons why governments go into debt are similar to the ones that private companies and individuals go into debt, namely income smoothing or, self-preservation or, there's positive NPV projects out there that need to be financed in some way. But what's different about public debt is that the mechanisms of enforcement are kind of lacking, or at least they're somewhat different, right? When we think of private debt, we think about courts and we think about, how you can kind of sue for a collection and you can get the sheriff to seize the collateral and so forth. And although I think there's plenty of situations where that remedy isn't available in the private world, as sort of a rule in the public sector, we respect sovereign immunity. And so, one of the great mysteries that economic historians have tried to tackle, and certainly this is something that I worked on in my graduate studies, was, first of all, why would a sovereign ever repay debt? And then, going back one step, why would anybody be crazy enough to lend money to a sovereign if that sovereign could not be taken to court? And you go way back and talk about, public debt as far back as the Romans, and you talk about the Florentine bankers and the Genoese bankers. And so, what is the general mechanism by which lenders to sovereigns can expect to get repaid? And I think this is something that a lot of people are starting to wonder right now, like with these large levels of debt, can we really expect to get repaid by these different sovereigns?
These are really interesting, fascinating questions currently and historically. I think one has to start by distinguishing domestic and foreign debt. So domestically, the answer is that there is a powerful domestic constituency of creditors of the government, of bondholders who are represented in politics, have spokesmen in the Congress. Historically, you see that the development of political systems where there are checks and balances on arbitrary action by the executive or the sovereign or the king, different names for the same entity. When you put in place a parliament or a legislature in which the creditors, among others, sit, they can push back against that arbitrary action. They impose checks and balances on what the state or sovereign can do and can't do. So that's why you see sovereign debt develop first in Republican city-states, like in the Italian case, Genoa, Florence, Venice. Then you see the market and public debt develop in the Netherlands when they put in place a legislature, the Estates General, in which the creditors sat. And then in England, after the Glorious Revolution, same story. So there's a debate at the moment about how much inflation we're going to see. That's one way that states can effectively default on their obligations, by inflating it away. And there are some who say there are going to be 5, 10, 15% rates of inflation in the advanced countries going forward. I think the creditors' lobby of mutual funds and insurance companies and pension funds and individual bondholders is going to scream bloody murder were that to happen. And they have representatives in the Congress who will speak up for their interests. So that's why domestic debt is repaid in the way it is, as often as it is. It becomes more complicated when you talk about external debt, when the creditors are foreigners who are not represented politically, domestically, and where sovereign immunity basically prevents them from taking effective legal action. For a long time, people argued it's the reputational damage that causes states to repay their foreign creditors. If they don't repay, the state gets locked out of international financial markets. And there was some pushback against that view in the 1980s from people like Jeremy Bulow and Ken Rogoff, who said, under a variety of circumstances, the immediate benefits of not having to repay outweigh the future costs of being excluded from the market. And then people began to explore corollary costs of defaulting on your external debts. Maybe you can't get trade credit and your exports are disrupted, or the creditor country retaliates with tariffs against your exports. Once upon a time, in addition, there was gunboat diplomacy, and back in the day, in the 19th century, sending in the gunboats, seizing the customs house where import taxes were raised, installing foreign commissioners to oversee the budget. Such things happened in the Caribbean and Central America, in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire. One likes to think we've moved beyond that in the 21st century, but if so, again, it points to the issue of how much importance those creditors are going to attach to maintaining their market access when the crunch comes next time.
I found an interesting example of a modern version of that was when the Elliott brothers seized that Argentine warship in Ghana, right? Where, they managed to somehow convince the court that they could seize a governmental asset in repayment of sovereign debt. But for that reputation to really matter, then, there has to be some collective action, right? Because presumably the borrowers can pit the creditors against one another and, selectively default. And, as we know, and even with bankruptcy, if you kind of repudiate your debts, you can often become an even more attractive borrower. So it seems like, reputation is not a super binding constraint, right? If we look at Argentina's managed to just serially default continuously for its entire history, right?
Well, so creditor representation is important, and it's always been a work in progress. At the beginning of the 19th century, the creditors all had names like Rothschild. So all you had to do was write your brother or your cousins, and you had a creditors cartel. As a market in sovereign bonds begins to develop and you have a large number of bondholders, you need a creditors organization, and then you see those beginning to be formed. In Europe in the 19th century, with names like the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders, with people like the Ricardo brothers doing the organizing, and then in the United States in the 20th century with names like Foreign Bondholders Protective Council. And they try to work hand in glove with the stock exchange to prevent the listing of new issues. As to why we see serial defaulters like Argentina or Greece, to pick a couple of examples not entirely at random, it's because the lenders are well compensated. Number one, they get a substantial risk premium ex ante. So if there are selective defaults ex post, they do tolerably well. Then they look for meaningful policy reforms, and if they think they see them, they begin to lend again. So part of the answer is that foreign lending paid despite these serial defaults because of the substantial risk premium ex ante. And number two, reputational damage can be repaired. There is the question of whether creditors are too willing to lend again, maybe because they expect to be bailed out, or maybe because they're poorly informed, maybe because there are these foreign lending manias where everybody jumps on the bandwagon. But if you look at the long sweep of history, foreign lending has paid about as well as lending to your domestic government. And if you do both, you get some diversification benefits.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the more interesting findings that you talked about in the book, which was that, at the end of the day, the rate of return that you receive on these highly risky, whether we call them emerging market bonds or, low credit quality bonds, when we factor in the defaults, it turns out that you do almost as well, or at least as well, on those highly risky securities as you do with the very, very high quality government bonds. But I guess the thing that people are concerned about now is, presumably with the U.S., is that the U.S., because it has control over the money supply, is not going to default in the sense that countries defaulted in the past, but would default through inflation. And if indeed the thing that protects the holders of governmental debt is their representation in the political process, where I guess it's fair to say that the creditors were the ones that governed in those Italian city-states. The creditors were the creditors committee. They're the ones that kind of governed the Dutch Republic and the England post-Glorious Revolution. Is it fair to say that the creditors continue to govern in a place like the U.S.? I mean, if you can't selectively default against domestic versus international through depreciation of the currency, I mean, who are the creditors of the U.S. right now? Given that we're making so much money from seniorage, aren't we relying a lot on folks that are either outside of the U.S. holding these fixed income securities, or even within the U.S., right? If there's inflation, it's going to benefit certain classes of people who also have representation, right? The folks who are debtors. Are the most powerful people in the U.S. the creditors, or are they the debtors?
So this question about inflating away the debt is the number one question that I get asked when I talk about my book to various audiences. Let me start indirectly, and then I'll get to the point. Indirectly, you are right that the number one difference in terms of thinking about debt consolidation between 19th century Britain, the case I argued before, and 21st century advanced countries is the universal adult franchise, that even though they did 2 reform acts in Britain in the 19th century, only men of significant property could participate in the process whereby members of parliament were selected. So in that situation, the creditors were much more powerful over these economic policy decisions than they are today. And that's why in Britain, they could run primary budget surpluses year after year for, wait for it, a century. Except in 1901 with the Boer War, every year for 90 plus years, and bring the debt ratio down from 200% of GDP to 15% of GDP. So we are in a different political situation today. My belief...
Well, I mean, also, you don't just describe that, what happened in England, but also, I mean, the United States went through something similar. France went through, something similar after the Franco-Prussian War. And so you have a number of examples of countries that racked up enormous debts and then, paid them down in a non-inflation, in fact, a deflationary way in many cases, right? So
right. And in all those cases, there was a more limited concept of what government should do, which I think made it easier as the economy grew and the import tariffs accruing to the federal government rose, to use those revenues to pay down the debt rather than to expand social programs or the other things we might consider today. In addition, most of those cases were cases of governments that were looking forward to the danger of another war, and they wanted to restore their capacity to borrow in the next emergency. So I think we should be worrying about those things today as well. Will climate change require massive increases in public debt issuance in order to finance climate change abatement and adaptation projects? Will we have to ramp up spending in response to another pandemic? Do we have to worry about Taiwan? There are lots of dangers we should be contemplating, and I think we should be worrying about whether we have come closer to exhausting our fiscal capacity as a nation, and therefore what to do about that. So now to come to your question, this is where my friend Charles Goodhart in the UK and I disagree. He thinks inflation is coming. I don't. He thinks the debtors' lobby is powerful. I think the creditors' lobby is equally powerful. So you alluded before to my book on populism. And an element in the populist revolt in the advanced economies, which hasn't been limited to the United States, of course, was the feeling that Wall Street got bailed out and Main Street didn't. After
this goes back to William Jennings Bryan. I mean, the populist strain has always been kind of in favor of protecting the debtor. It's the creditors were always seen as the wealthy, and the debtors were always seen as kind of the farmers and the the regular people, right, that had to go to the big money banks and pay exorbitant interest rates to the Wall Street interests, right?
It goes back to Andrew Jackson, indeed. So it goes back to the Luddites and the Captain Swing revolt in England. But I digress. I think my view is that anything that were to roil financial markets excessively in the United States would create political trouble in the United States. Any attempt to compromise the independence of the Federal Reserve would elicit a negative reaction on Wall Street that would hit people right in their 401ks. And I don't think the Congress would follow through in terms of seriously compromising the independence of the Fed. Stability culture is deeply ingrained in our central bankers in this day and age. I do think they are committed to their inflation targets. So I can imagine some years of 3 or 4% inflation. But that's not going to be enough to make a serious dent in our inherited debt burdens. Inflation would have to be jumped up faster. It would have to be ratcheted up repeatedly. We'd have to have successive episodes of surprise inflation as investors shifted to shorter maturity debt. And I don't think our political systems and central banks are prepared to go there. So let's do a follow-up in 5 years. And you can call me on that forecast.
Well, I mean, I'm curious about this because when you think of the Jane Austen novels, right, the Darcy and all those guys, right, they were evaluated based on their holdings of government bonds. But I don't know anybody who holds government bonds. I mean, everybody I know is sitting on Apple stock and Amazon stock, and everybody's that I know is like sitting on equities, except for the folks who have pension funds, and they're the ones that are sitting on a lot of debt, and they're generally not as wealthy as the people we might think of as the elites, who are primarily sensitive to equities, right, and private equity in particular, right. If you think about who are Schwartzman and all the Wall Street folks, they're short fixed income, right. So wouldn't they love it if they could kind of get rid of all their debts through inflation?
So I haven't looked at the capitalization of the Treasury bond funds lately, but holdings of bond funds are widespread. Do you have some money in money market mutual funds?
Well, more than I would like.
You're not getting rich off them, but the point is that an awful lot of people hold Treasury securities indirectly, and they're aware of the fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think the U.S. is in a unique position because we are indeed the kind of currency of choice, and so we have borrowing power that other countries don't seem to have. Would your description of the kind of your faith in our ability to absorb this debt, do you think that that's something that other countries, other countries generally don't have this luxury, and certainly the way the EU is organized, it doesn't seem to have the capacity to lever up to the extent that the U.S. can?
Well, so the EU has historically had the problem that its central bank wouldn't backstop the treasury market until Mario Draghi came along in 2012 with do whatever it takes, and did change that. So now I think the euro area is a more normal economy in financially in terms of its public debt bearing capacity. The EU is special because it has historically had a much more bank-based and less securities market-based financial system. And that remains the case relative to the United States, even today. So in the book, we look at the different approaches that governments have taken historically to stabilize and reduce high inherited debts. And the answer is that only under very exceptional circumstances, such as the 19th century circumstances that I described before, is there a silver bullet where you can do one thing like run persistent government budget surpluses. Generally, you have to do three things: run budget surpluses or narrow the budget deficit, grow the economy, which is critically important. And there, I think the United States does arguably have an advantage over Europe and Japan in that our demographics are more favorable. Our startup culture is more favorable. Time will tell how this plays out, but I think there's scope for growing the economy. And number three, tolerating a little bit of inflation and avoiding deflation. And I think the Fed is committed to hitting its inflation target, 2 or 3 or 4% inflation for the foreseeable future. Europe and Japan have had much more difficulty getting inflation up to target. So I think we are in a more fortunate situation from that point of view. A sharp increase in interest rates would throw that process of debt consolidation off course. But if you agree with the Congressional Budget Office's forecast of how the development of the debt is going to evolve, they have their own forecasts of GDP growth and inflation and so forth. They think that our currently public debt in the hands of the public, as we speak together, is 100% of GDP. They see it as rising to like 107% of GDP by 2030. Is that alarming? No. Is it optimal? Probably not. It would be nice if we could bring that debt down and give ourselves a little more wiggle room to use next time we're confronted with an emergency. But I don't see obvious reasons why we, or for that matter, the financial markets, should panic. If you look at what they expect the 10-year Treasury yield to be 10 years out, they don't expect it to be a whole lot higher than it is now.
So you talk a bit about some of the debt crises that have happened. And one of the stories that I found most interesting was when you're discussing kind of the emerging market debt crisis, which happened not that long after the kind of oil crisis, right? So the oil economies flooded the Western banking systems with petrodollars, and then the banks decided to recycle that by lending to emerging markets, particularly in Latin America. And it didn't turn out so well. And I think as a result of that experience, it really drew attention to kind of, why are they borrowing the money, and what uses is this money being put to? And I think you described kind of Lawson's rule, right? Which is, hey, if you're borrowing just to finance consumption, that probably is neither going to increase the size of the pie, nor is it going to increase the creditworthiness of the borrower. But if you're investing in, say, positive NPV projects, right, like infrastructure, that will ultimately increase the size of the pie and thereby increasing the taxable kind of assets that the government can access, that's going to enhance the creditworthiness of the borrower. Is that something that, I mean, has that rule, is that a good way to think about it? When should we use that kind of thinking when we're thinking about kind of borrowing? I mean, if you're taking money out of the private sector and put it in the public sector, then presumably we want the rate of return on that investment in the public sector to be higher than what it would be in the private sector. Is that a rule that what are the limits of that rule? What are the limits? That seems like an interpretation that would be consistent with, say, traditional financial thinking.
Yeah, so Nigel Lawson, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, did make this distinction: borrowing for investment, good; borrowing for consumption, bad. And then we learned that this is too simple. Number one, there can be productive investment and non-productive investment. So in Asia in the 1990s, Thailand borrowed in order to build empty skyscrapers in Bangkok. Unproductive investment. Makes one think of Evergrande in China at the moment, but I'll leave that one aside. Number two, even if the investment is productive, if you're funding it by borrowing abroad in foreign currency, your access to the funds may dry up because of events beyond your control. A shock to global financial markets may cause a sudden stop in capital inflows, and your ability to roll over the debts you've incurred or borrow more may be interrupted. So I think it's important to think about the productivity of the investment, and it's important to think about how the investment is funded. Similarly, if you're borrowing short-term and imagining you can roll over those short-term debts continuously, and then something happens in financial markets, a taper tantrum, for example, an investment that was productive before might suddenly become unproductive. Now, I think, having said that, the basic logic is intact, and that's why I find it peculiar. I find it perverse that there is so much insistence in the U.S. Congress, as we speak here in the fall of 2021, that the infrastructure package should be fully funded out of current tax revenues. If it's productive investment, then there's a sound argument that you can borrow to finance it. The productivity of investments, to be sure, is easier to talk about than to measure. Congressional opponents of borrowing will talk about pork and log rolling. Proponents of social infrastructure will talk about the high social rate of return to investing in kids in preschool. These are hard things to measure, but I think they're the right things to talk about.
Yeah, I think sometimes the concern is that the borrowing will be justified by some argument, and then the kind of funds will be redeployed into a completely different use. I advise a lot of public pension funds, and oftentimes there will be these kind of pension bonds that are issued, presumably to shore up the pension fund, but then the funds are kind of redeployed for current spending, and so the funding gap sort of stays the same both before and after issuance of these bonds. But I think that one of the things that we learned, I think, in the 90s was that there's a demand for government bonds, that government bonds provide value as assets, kind of independent of the uses to which those funds are put. And I think one could argue that the shortage of kind of government bonds in the 90s, as we kind of drew down our deficits and our debt, stimulated a demand for, whether it's agency debt or, commercial paper, and could have, fueled the rise of the kind of housing bubble, was, precisely because there just wasn't enough government bonds to satisfy this demand for liquidity. Can you justify? Can you sort of say, hey, if I can, if the government is seen not as borrower, but actually kind of a manufacturer of these instruments for which there is demand, shouldn't they just simply maximize their profits by cranking out this thing that everybody seems to want to buy?
Well, everything in proportion would be my answer to that. If you go back and look at the history, you see the value to financial markets of sovereign debt, that as sovereigns and states' debts begin to be recognized as safe and liquid with political checks and balances, they become safe with the development of markets in them. They become more liquid. They're then used as collateral for other borrowing and lending. And you accelerate the development of private financial markets. So I think the political capacity to issue public debt goes hand in hand with financial development, and financial development historically is an important component of economic development. So one of the points we make in the book is that sovereign debt becomes widespread in Europe before it becomes widespread anywhere else, before the Ottoman Empire and China and Japan, et cetera, et cetera. Why? I think because of Europe's political geography, physical geography, but you get sovereign debt to fight wars in Europe before anywhere else. You get private financial markets in Europe, well-developed private financial markets in Europe before anywhere else, because of that public debt issuing capacity. And you get the Industrial Revolution, partly because of the financial development that precedes and accompanies it. But you started with the 1990s, and I think the point there is right, that the prospect that public debt will disappear, it's incredible to remember, but it's true. We worried about that in the late 1990s as the Clinton administration began to pay down the debt, had all kinds of untoward financial consequences. Among other things, as people scramble for the remaining public debt, you get this problem of ultra low interest rates that we're still trying to work our way out of. Now, you get financial markets wondering what other kind of benchmarks they're going to be used to price riskier securities, and you get this rush into agency securities and other investments with unintended consequences. So I think public debt does serve a variety of constructive financial purposes from that point of view, but I don't think that's a license for overissuing. If you overissue, on the other hand, the safety that is one of the defining characteristics of public debt in well-working financial systems can be lost as well.
So how do we know what the optimal amount of public debt is? I mean, that kind of, I guess the private analogy would be simply to say, well, okay, if the positive NPV projects dry up, then, we should stop issuing debt. But it seems like the debt capacity can vary for reasons that are completely independent of that, right? And if we go look at the COVID-19 crisis, it's hard to say that the money that we've borrowed is going to be used for positive NPV projects, right? But for some reason, I think that we seem to be able to tolerate this much larger. Does that say to us, hey, maybe we were borrowing too little before this crisis? Maybe we should have been borrowing these amounts all along? If we believe the kind of new monetary theory, then we may have been kind of under borrowing all this time, and it's only the COVID-19 crisis that has kind of awakened us to this borrowing capacity that was way out there that we didn't even know about? Is that one way to think about it?
Yeah. So to start, I don't think economic science has advanced to the point where we can identify an optimal or uniquely sustainable level of public debt. I think politics impinges on this as well. So if you ask a German politician and an American politician what an appropriate or optimal level of public debt is, they'll give you very different answers. Economic circumstances change over time as well. So U.S. public debt in the hands of the public has basically tripled since the turn of the century, yet debt service, interest paid on that debt as a share of GDP, hasn't budged. Interest rates have come down, and they've been trending downward for the better part of 30 or 40 years. That has made it easier to sustain a heavier level of public debt. So I don't think that behavior necessarily adapts quickly to changing facts, but that's an economic fact. We do have to worry, as you and I were discussing earlier, about what's going to happen to interest rates going forward. You have to have a view of why interest rates have come down over the last 3 or 4 decades in order to formulate some conjectures about what's likely to happen going forward. My own view is that I don't think we're going to see a sharp, sudden reversal of the secular decline in real interest rates that we've seen in the advanced economies. I don't think secular stagnation, to give that decline in real interest rates a name, which has been going on for decades, is going to be reversed between now and the midterm elections. Although, again, somewhat slightly higher interest rates are probably in the cards now. But I think the answer is that circumstances changed so that we could meet an emergency equivalent to war starting in March of 2020 with a warlike fiscal response. And I think that was appropriate. I do think the response could have been better. We could have avoided giving additional relief checks to families with household incomes of $150,000 in December of 2020 and March of 2021. But I think by and large, the debt we've incurred as a result, first of the global financial crisis and now of the pandemic, was in a good cause.
Well, I was wondering if we could go back to first principles and you could tell us a bit about Ricardian equivalence, right? Because this is something that, comes up over and over again whenever we talk about kind of public debt. And, the question is, well, why doesn't Ricardian equivalence apply, right? What is it about Ricardian equivalence? What is it about the assumptions behind it that don't hold? Why is it that we still teach this, even though we know that it's an abstraction which has limited applicability in practice?
So this is the second time Ricardo has come up in this discussion, probably the first time he's been mentioned twice in one of your podcasts. But so Ricardian equivalence, for the non-specialist listener, is the idea that debt is going to have to be serviced and people are going to have to pay taxes to pay the interest on the debt. And the current spending by the government will be exactly offset by reduced spending on the part of households, anticipating having to pay more taxes in the future, and therefore anticipating that their permanent incomes will be correspondingly lower. All of which means there will be no impact of deficit spending on the macro economy. Why is that wrong in practice? For 2 reasons. Number one, because some households are liquidity constrained, and if you give a working class household a relief check, they will spend more because they have to put food on the table or whatever, in a world where it's not possible for everyone to borrow against their future labor income. deficit spending can still matter in a Ricardian world. And secondly, because if the deficit spending occurs now in 2020, and people expect that they will be paying slightly higher taxes to service that debt for the 20-year life of the bonds issued to finance that, their permanent income will be going down a little bit every one of those 20 years, but there'll be a big boost to public spending right now. And the right now part will swamp the slight increase in private spending due to increased taxes spread over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've talked about the different ways in which governments have reduced their debt after big run-ups. And of course, in addition to running surpluses for an extended period of time, there are some other options, right? There's just default, right, and inflation, and there's kind of financial repression, which some governments use to kind of make it easier for them to continue to access funds. What are the determining factors that would lead governments to choose one versus the other? I know that's a big question, but maybe contextualize it in terms of where you think the developed countries are going to go. And it's not just the developed countries. The developing countries have also had to incur massive debts in order to get through both of these recent crises. And I think they're situated a bit differently. They haven't had the ability to run up as big of debts because they don't have the same borrowing capacity, but they're also in a position where they have more debt. Do you think we'll see a bunch of countries choose the inflation route, a bunch will choose maybe the default route, others will continue down the financial repression route, and then of course there's also the growth route, right? So if you run surpluses in a world without growth, that's going to cause a lot of suffering. But most of the stories where they've kind of run surpluses, they've been able to do so because of growth. Will we be able to grow our way out of this? Will all countries, you think, have the capacity? I certainly think in the U.S. our productivity is underappreciated. The productivity growth that we've seen in the last decade or two has been underappreciated, and I certainly expect it to continue.
Well, I'm confident in saying that no, not all countries are going to be able to grow their way out of the public debt inheritance. We are going to see debt restructurings in quite a number of low-income countries that did incur additional debt to bilateral debt to foreign governments, which is on hiatus until the end of next year, but probably not on hiatus after that. But also debt to private financial markets, where the Group of 20 has asked private creditors to restructure that debt on concessional terms for low-income countries, and private creditors have not said a peep in response. So there's that collective action problem that you were talking about before as well. Clearly, growing the economy is the painless way of growing out from a debt overhang, and economies are going to differ in their success at doing that. My reading of the productivity record in the United States is a little more gloomy than yours. There was this burst of productivity growth here between 1995 and 2005, after which, by all measures, productivity growth, total factor productivity growth has slowed. It's slowed even more in other countries like the UK. So the question there going forward is what's going to happen to productivity growth after the pandemic? There are those who say optimistically, we have figured out how to do telehealth and do our banking online and work from home and record podcasts. And all that is going to translate into faster productivity growth going forward. All I can say about that, well, I can say two things about that. Number one, there's zero evidence of that in the productivity statistics so far. TFP growth in the US and elsewhere has been totally driven by the cycle It went way up during the early stages of the pandemic when low productivity workers in hospitality, restaurants, hotels, and the like were laid off. And it's reverse course now that some of those people are going back to work, but we don't know what's happening to productivity yet. And number two, new general purpose technologies take quite a while before their rollout shows up in the productivity statistics. This has been true of the personal computer. It was true of the internal combustion engine. It was true of electricity. It takes a decade or more between the rollout and the economy adapting to the new technology. The computer shows up everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, as Bob Solow put it in 1985, and then it showed up in 1995. We can hope, but I do agree that different economies are going to respond in different ways in trying to manage this problem of debt consolidation as a function of their politics. And we were talking at the top of the podcast about exactly those politics, but also as a function of the structure of their financial markets. So if you have a relatively lightly regulated financial system like we do in the United States today, certainly compared to the US financial system after World War II, then the scope for financial repression is less. You can do financial repression really in two ways. Number one, you can put a cap on interest rates, and that can be done either with a regulation like Regulation Q way back then, or by having the central bank cap interest rates while it's not capping inflation. And that brings us back to that earlier discussion about whether stability culture is deeply ingrained in our central banking community or not. And the second way you can do financial repression is by force-feeding government bonds to the banks, requiring banks and financial institutions more generally to hold more and more of the debt, which will keep the yield, the interest rate down. And there we've learned a lot about what economists, especially in Europe, call the diabolic loop, that public debt problems and banking problems can feed on one another. And the more you force feed low-yielding government securities to the banks, the more trouble the banks are apt to end up in. So regulators don't want to go there either. So I conclude that in our advanced economies today, scope for financial repression is less than it was after World War II. But that middle-income emerging markets, I think we will see these kind of measures in a number of those countries where financial markets are less liberalized. Maybe central bank independence is a bit weaker, and financial repression will be used.
Well, a lot of these countries that have had financial crises, including ours, have come about not because of solvency problems, but liquidity problems. And so, the solution to that is bankruptcy. But we don't have a system in place for bankruptcy when it comes to sovereign debt. We have a lender of last resort in the form of the IMF that can sometimes step in and kind of, strong arm creditors to maybe get together and offer haircuts and so forth and restructurings. But we don't really have kind of a formal system in the same way that we do for private companies in the form of Chapter 11. Is this something that is this something that's even feasible? How would we set something like that up? There's been so many discussions about this over the last 30 years, but we haven't really made progress at the institutional level. Is this something that's realistic?
No, it isn't. So I go way back on this issue. I think it was in 2001, the first deputy managing director of the IMF, Anne Kruger, made a proposal for a sovereign debt restructuring court, a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. She called it mechanism, being a more politically palatable word than court. And as soon as the U.S. Congress got wind of such an idea, that there would be another international court akin to the dispute settlement panel of the WTO, but worse. That went exactly nowhere. So I had been working at the time on contractual mechanisms, clauses that you put into bond contracts that could make the process of restructuring sovereign debts easier. And we have seen the adoption of those clauses in the last 20 years, so-called collective action or collective representation clauses, where in order to restructure a government's debt, you only need the agreement of 70% of the bondholders, not 100%, and then the terms are crammed down. Bankruptcy court language, crammed down on the remaining 30%. So that's an element of a solution. And there are other ideas along those lines. If we come to a point where there are widespread defaults and need to restructure sovereign debts in multiple low-income countries, we're going to have a problem because all these mechanisms work slowly. So there are other things that can be done. I'll give you two examples. Number one, we could have President Biden issue an executive order that strengthens sovereign immunity for sovereign debtors and prevented vulture funds from going to the Superior Court for the Southern District of New York, where bonds are issued and litigated, and trying to enforce their claims by seizing a ship or an airliner when it lands at Kennedy Airport or whatever. Secondly, in 2003, when we sought to shield the new Iraqi government's financial assets from seizure by creditors who held its old debts, the United Nations passed a resolution that effectively bound its members to impose those shields. So the UN is another venue that could be pursued. But those are all partial solutions. And I think in a world of realpolitik, partial solutions are the only workable ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to return to the book on populism because we didn't really talk much about it, but it's a fascinating book. It certainly was very timely when it came out. And first of all, I think that your description of Trump is a very odd populist. His policies are not kind of they're a little bit different from what you would expect from a populist, and it's not clear whether he's a populist just in terms of his appeal as opposed to his policies. But I think a lot of people are critical of the political system now because they think that the actors are responding to very, very short-term considerations, and that the public is focused almost entirely on very, very short-term considerations, and that the long-term consequences are things that never make it into the news cycle. And the idea of a kind of a long-term strategy, whether it's military, whether it's public health, whether it's social welfare, or whether it's fiscal, is something that is completely foreign to the decision makers because they're focused on the election cycle and they're focused on the latest tweets that come out and have to kind of respond to them. Can we think in terms of like a institutional rate of time preference, right? An institutional discount rate. I mean, certainly when we look at some of the developing countries and the borrowing policies that they had, they were really more focused on preserving the power of the politicians in the short run rather than kind of expanding the long-term productivity of the economies. Have we in the United States become kind of like banana republics where our rulers are thinking only about, staying in power for the short run, or is that too pessimistic of a view? I mean, is it that if it's impossible to make decisions in the short run because anything that impacts the long run will be immediately reflected in the bond market? I remember when Bob Rubin said to Clinton that his most powerful constituency was the bond market, and that meant that future consequences would be immediately revealed in current support. Have we kind of gotten farther away from that, or Is that sort of a myth?
50 banana republics. You should have said 49 and left out California. But I think the California case is revealing in that it's kind of one-party government, where what we clearly see in a variety of other states and the national level is high levels of political polarization, with one party, when it's in power, trying to ram through its agenda before it loses office in the next election, and the other party reverses what it's done. So it's hard to take a long-term perspective in a highly polarized, fractionalized political environment with a high level of political and electoral uncertainty, where the parties rotate in office and each then undoes what the other has rammed through in the immediate preceding case. So how have we gotten here, and what might be done about it? I think gerrymandering has been a large part of the problem in the United States. There's little incentive to be a centrist politician. You want to be as extreme on one side or the other in order to outflank your opponent in the primary, which is where all the action is in a gerrymandered district, because the general election outcome is fait accompli. Money in politics and echo chamber media are part of the story as well. I have an earlier strand of work. You mentioned golden fetters, about the gold standard in the Great Depression. Why did some countries succumb to problems in the 1920s and others not? There I made an argument about the structure of the electoral system, that some electoral systems provide an incentive to move to the middle. As we speak, they're forming a coalition government in Germany that's going to presumably be relatively centrist, and because it will have parties on the left and parties on the right, both in the government, and it's going to have to span the political spectrum. And I think it's easier to make longer-term politics in that kind of setting than one in which you flip from a government on the left to a government on the right and back. And that kind of electoral uncertainty and political polarization is what we see in banana republics.
Right. Well, let's hope that we don't head too far in that direction, and we can make more longer term decisions going forward, both in terms of our fiscal and our monetary policies. Barry, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Once again, check out this book, In Defense of Public Debt. We barely scratched the surface. There's so much historical richness in the book, going all the way back, again, to the Romans and moving forward to contemporary times. And I think the Populist Temptation, it's certainly still relevant, even though it was written a few years ago. Thank you so much, Barry.
Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.